Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about these series of videos that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And, of course, for those of you that did not end up watching the fight card this weekend, of course, with the headliner being that Artur Beterbiev versus Dimitri Bivol in the rematch, where, of course, Dimitri Bivol ended up kind of pulling off the upset, or at least he did, I believe, to the odds makers and also to me because I expected Artur Beterbiev to win. But of course, there was a great series of fights on there. Of course, Virgil Ortiz versus Israel Madrimov. That was a little great fight, and it was a great matchup between a former champion and someone who, of course, is on the rise, and that of a Virgil Ortiz Jr. Of course, we had Hamza Shiraz versus Carlos Adams. I did not agree with the decision. I thought that Carlos Adams should have won the fight, at least with only watching the fight one time, but maybe I'll have to rewatch it, maybe see if I did not see something the first time around. I'm not quite sure. And of course, there was a certain amount of other great fights as well. Parker versus that of Martin McCauley. Of course, it could have been better because McCauley showed up at apparently 310 pounds with his fat ass, and of course did not show up in the best of condition, but it is what it is. It's whatever. But of course, Shakur Stevenson, who is looked at as a guy that also has a great amount of top pound for pound potential, he also was on this fight card. Now, of course, originally he was not supposed to fight Joshua Padley, of course, the British fighter that apparently was formerly an electrician and recently only got into boxing, or at least has been on the rise as of recent. Of course, that was not supposed to be the fight that ended up happening. He was supposed to fight one of the top contenders, I believe, from America, in Mr. Floyd Schofield. But of course, Mr. Schofield, apparently he was sick or quote unquote poison, whatever it was. Of course, certain people believe that he ducked Shakur, whatever the situation was. Of course, that fight pretty much was squashed. But of course, Shakur Stevenson, he ended up putting up a very good performance against Joshua Padley, where of course it took him 9 rounds to stop Joshua Padley. But a certain amount of people, of course, are criticizing Shakur Stevenson's performance, and they've been criticizing his performances now for the past few fights. And let me tell you what, I don't completely blame people. Now, Shakur Stevenson, of course, is an exceptionally talented boxer. He's someone that is very gifted. But the reason why I have to label this video is Shakur Stevenson a little bit overrated is because many people are claiming that Shakur Stevenson is a top 5 pound per pound level guy and that he's a guy that later on could become eventually the #1 pound per pound guy. Now, I'm not going to definitively state that Shakur Stevenson is overrated, but what I will state is this. A lot of people, of course, they'll kind of tell you that the criticism of Shakur Stevenson is a little bit unfair. And let me tell you this, I don't think that it is. And a certain amount of people overall may think, why would that not be particularly fair? Well, let me tell you this. And we're going to review a video by DontaesBoxingNation. He, of course, is going to go into his regular victimized mentality to where, of course, he cannot see any shades of gray whatsoever. But anyways, when it comes down to, he's going to be, of course, complaining about why Shakur Stevenson, why were they complaining about his performance, but not Hamza Shiraz's or some of these other guys. Shakur Stevenson has a whole different level of expectations on him. And Dante's Boxing Nation with Canelo Alvarez, for example, he just fought 2 guys in a row that were a decent amount bigger than him and guys that at least had decent level power and were both formerly undefeated fighters. And Canelo Alvarez clearly beat both guys, in my personal view, at least about 9 rounds to 3. But Dante's Boxing Nation criticized, well, how come Canelo Alvarez, if he's that good, how come he can't knock those guys out? And those guys are not the 2 main fights that people wanted to see, right? And I'm not stating that Shakur is necessarily avoiding anybody necessarily, but what I will state is this. He's in the ring against fighters that would be looked at as C-grade level fighters. I don't even remember the last guy that he fought before this guy, Joshua Padley, but I know that he wasn't that exceptionally talented. And it's no offense against Shakur Stevenson, but other than that of an Oscar Valdez and maybe a Jamel Herring, it's like, who have you really fought? And it's no offense against Shakur Stevenson. He was very dominant against Jamel Herring. He was also very dominant against Oscar Valdez. But to be quite honest with you, Shakur Stevenson at the very least is at least a natural 130 pounder, if not a natural 135 pounder. I think that he's a bit bigger than someone like a Vasily Lomachenko, at least debatably, or at least around the same size as him. So the thing is about Shakur Stevenson is that even though I really like him as a fighter, I think that he's an exceptional level fighter. You're in the ring with guys that you really should be stopping. And at the end of the day, of course, is he the only fighter that, of course, had high praise and isn't knocking guys out? No, of course, we've seen that before. We've seen it with Araceli Lara. We've seen it with Guillermo Rigondeaux. We've seen it with, maybe Billy Joe Saunders or certain fighters like that maybe have a little bit more of a defensive style, but they didn't always get the stoppage in some of their fights. But at the end of the day, other than Guillermo Rigondeaux, none of those guys that I mentioned really were looked at as debatably one of the top 5, or at least a certified, like 100% a lock for the top 10 pound for pound. It just is what it is. So, I mean, like I said, Shakur Stevenson is going to get some criticism, and it's going to be a little bit of rightful criticism. It just is what it is. Now, I don't think that Shakur Stevenson should get criticism for being a fighter that, of course, is quote-unquote unskilled, or someone that, is clearly, not skilled. Of course, he's an exceptionally skilled fighter. But is he ever going to be the #1 pound for pound fighter? I'm not ever quite sure if I see that. And it's not because he's not exceptionally talented. But I've always stated this, or I've stated this within my most recent videos, but I've also kind of stated this in the past. In order to be the #1 pound for pound fighter, even debatably at one point in time, but especially consistently, and I mean like, deserving to be there, fighters like that of a Crawford or a Canelo or a Usyk or certain guys like that, even at one time a Lomachenko, you have to have the all-around package. And there's certain things that Shakur Stevenson may even be more talented in than those guys. But the problem is that Shakur Stevenson, very clearly, he just does not have a grade level punching power. And of course, certain people, they may take a look and say, well, Pernell Sleepy Whitaker and Floyd Mayweather, those are the two examples, of course, that people always want to say that those guys really didn't have that much of power. And of course, they were debatably the #1 pound for pound fighter at one point in time. And you can kind of state that, but Floyd Mayweather, when he was at 147, he still had B grade level power. And people forget that Floyd's not really a natural welterweight. He's a guy that, overall really belongs more at the 140-pound weight class. He's a guy that really does not belong at 147 or 154 in terms of the actual weight and the actual size. Now, height and reach-wise, he kind of belongs there, but in terms of weight-wise, he doesn't really belong there. And when you talk about that of a Pernell Sweet Whitaker, I mean, he didn't have the most amount of knockouts, but it was really a little bit more of his style. And Pernell Sweet Whitaker still had clear power to set his fighters back. Like, there are certain fighters to where you can look at them and they have more power than what is really led on. It's just their type of style. Like Dimitri Bivol, for example. Bivol actually has a grade level power. It's just that you wouldn't really know it because Bivol's not a guy that's just going to go out there, try to beat the hell out of you, brawl with you, or a guy that's really going to knock you out, or Sonny Lara or Guillermo Rigondeaux, for example. Both of those fighters, for example, have a grade level power. They actually, in my personal view, they have great level power. At least Rigondeaux does. But because of their more defensive style and the way that they box, you wouldn't always know that. Shakur Stevenson is a guy to where even when he sits down on his punches and he's giving it all his might, he just does not have a grade level power. It just is what it is. But anyways, Dante's Boxing Nation is going to talk about it. Let's tune in and let's see overall what he has to say.
So Shakur Stevenson, he got the knockout win over Josh Padley. He stopped him in the 9th round. Now, Shakur Stevenson, he did what he was supposed to do, but it was a strange performance, which I'm going to get into a little bit later.
Well, he did what he was supposed to do in terms of clearly outboxing that of a Joshua Padley, but did he really do what he was supposed to do in terms of the expectations of the quote-unquote pound-for-pound list? And I know that a certain amount of people overall will state, well, sometimes the pound-for-pound list isn't always about how you do it. It's just about if you keep on winning, right? But it's not like Shakur Stevenson is in there with a guy that, overall was an A or B grade level fighter. He was in there against a guy that, had 2 days notice, was a guy that really had not fought anybody in his career, and was a guy that had only 4 knockouts on his resume. And it took you 9 rounds to knock that guy out? Like, are you serious? At the end of the day, once again, it just is what it is. Dominance and skill set, overall is going to be a part of the game. Now, if you're one of these guys that looks severely dominant against a whole bunch of bums, like a Roberto Soto Ramirez or someone like a Deontay Wilder or even Crawford a little bit there at the welterweight division, then to me it doesn't really mean a whole lot. But at the end of the day, it's like, Shakur Stevenson, he's fighting guys. I mean, at least with Crawford and Wilder, what I'll say about them is that at least they were knocking those guys out, or they were looking pretty dominant against those guys mainly. Shakur Stevenson, I mean, he's looking somewhat dominant against these guys in terms of boxing ability, but like, come on, like, are you serious? Like, people used to criticize, like, I remember when Canelo fought Billy Joe Saunders, and people were criticizing Billy Joe Saunders that he didn't have any level of power. Billy Joe Saunders might have more level power for his particular weight classes than what Shakur Stevenson had. I at least seen Billy Joe Saunders, like, kind of have Canelo Alvarez at bay for a little bit, and that's what kind of worries me with Shakur Stevenson if he fights Gervonta Tank Davis. I don't know if he's going to have anywhere near the level of power in order to defeat Gervonta Tank Davis. And in order to beat Gervonta Tank Davis, I think that he pretty much is going to have to be on the run and pretty much overall going to have to outspeed and out-technique Gervonta Tank Davis the whole time. And that's going to be a problem when, Gervonta Tank Davis, first of all, not only is an exceptional level fighter, but if he doesn't respect your power coming back at him when it comes down to it, Gervonta Tank Davis may not give a shit about what's coming back at him, because maybe Shakur does not really have the ability to knock Gervonta Tank Davis down, at least consistently. And I think that a fighter is going to have to really gain Gervonta Tank Davis's respect. I don't know if Shakur Stevenson can do that, but we'll see.
But I wanted to talk about what Gervonta Tank Davis had to say about Shakur's performance.
And to be quite honest with you, even if Shakur Stevenson and Lomachenko fought right now it doesn't appear like Lomachenko really wants either the Gervonta Tank Davis or Shakur Stevenson fight as of right now. But even Lomachenko, and he's like, what, 37 years old right now? Maybe even, 38, somewhere around there. Vasily Lomachenko, like, he may even have a very decent chance to beat Shakur Stevenson right now. Because say whatever you want about Lomachenko, he's not really a natural 135 pounder, and he has certain flaws, but it's like Lomachenko, one thing, people always say that Lomachenko, that he wasn't a great puncher, but actually that's not the case. People forget that Lomachenko at 130 and at 126, he was running through everybody. Like, he was hurting people really bad, not just Roman Martinez. Now, Roman Martinez is not an A-grade level fighter, really, but, he was someone that was a former champion. Lomachenko knocked him out in very vicious fashion. He also made Nicholas Walters quit. He made Guillermo Rigondeaux quit. He knocked out Jorge Linares, who, of course, had been stopped before, but was pretty much at the best point in his career once he had adapted. And then, of course, he knocked out a couple of other fighters. He knocked out George Kambosos, was the only one to do that to this day. Lomachenko is an A-grade level puncher. It's just that he's in a weight class that he's kind of outsized in. But Shakur Stevenson, in my personal view, I just don't know if he's going to really have the ability to beat some of these bigger names. But we'll see.
Gervonta, he reacted by putting up this post, and all he said was LOL. Those three letters say a lot, actually, because Gervonta, he's never...
And certain people may come back and say, well, that's not fair. Shakur Stevenson, of course, beat Jamel Herring. He beat, overall Oscar Valdez, right? But when I say bigger names, I'm not talking about guys that have limited boxing ability and on top of that are smaller than you. Because when you took a look at Shakur and Oscar Valdez, I mean, come on. Shakur Stevenson is like, what, 5'8" with the 68, 69-inch arm reach. Oscar Valdez, I don't know how long his reach is, but the man is about like 5'4". Like, give me a break. It is what it is. All right. And then when you talk about Jamel Herring, he's a decent fighter, but he was never an A-grade level fighter. The biggest win in his career was over a Carl Frampton that was way outsized in that weight class. Never really should have been in that weight class in the first place, and probably at the more down point in his career. So the point is that, other than those two wins, and to be quite honest with you, I never thought that Jamel Herring was an A-grade level opponent. It just is what it is. And looking at Oscar Valdez recently against Emmanuel Navarrete, I'm not really quite sure if his resume is even holding up at this personal moment in time. Now, that's not me stating that he's ducked fighters necessarily. I think that there have been certain fights that have avoided him, such as Gervonta Tank Davis and Lomachenko to a degree. But at the end of the day, once again, even if he fought those guys, I'm not quite sure if he would beat either of them.
Reacted this way when it comes to a Shakur Stevenson fight. I started by telling you guys that this was a strange performance by Shakur Stevenson. And I think Gervonta Tank Davis,
Well, why was it really a strange performance by Shakur Stevenson? Is this a Shakur Stevenson that we've not seen in the past? Have we seen Shakur Stevenson just go for broke in certain fights, not try to out-technique his opponents, and on top of that, be a little bit more defensively responsible, sometimes a little bit too defensive for his own good, and then on top of that, get knockouts early on or halfway through the fight? Why would this be a strange performance from Shakur Stevenson?
Seen the same things that a lot of us seen. What I noticed, especially in the first...
Now, of course, DontaesBoxingNation, what he's talking about is that it was strange because Shakur Stevenson should have been able to stop this guy much earlier. Right, but nothing really surprised me about this. To me, it wasn't really a strange performance because what that just personally tells me is that Shakur Stevenson, that he even realizes that he doesn't have that it factor, at least when it comes to the power, in terms of hurting guys at 135. And that's why moving up the weight classes, that it's also a big deal. But Shakur Stevenson, he has pretty much every other category that's great. He just doesn't have the power. And unfortunately, that is going to be a part of what makes you great. So we'll see what happens.
3 or 4 rounds is Shakur did not look as comfortable in the ring as he usually looks. For example, when it comes to this guy, Josh...
To me, Shakur Stevenson looked exactly the same. And to me, Shakur Stevenson actually looked more comfortable in this fight. And he should have been. Now, I can understand a little bit of discomfort or being a little bit uncomfortable because this guy was a little bit more technically savvy and had a little bit more heart than what a lot of people gave him credit for coming into the fight. And on top of that, he's a guy that, was in great shape and he came in on 2 days' notice. But at the end of the day, so of course you didn't really prepare for a style like this, or you didn't at least prepare for this fighter. But at the end of the day, it's like, dude, like this guy came in on 2 days' notice. He's clearly definitely not any A grade level fighter. I'm not really even sure if he's a B grade level fighter. Maybe we'll find out later on if he is. I think that he's a little bit more talented than what certain people give him credit for. I'll give Joshua Padley this. He at least overall kept some of the rounds somewhat competitive, at least in terms of limiting Shakur Stevenson's ability to get certain punches in there. But I mean, Shakur Stevenson, you're allegedly one of the top 10 pound for pound boxers in the whole sport. And I think that he is. But at the end of the day, his title as being one of the top 10 pound for pound fighters in the world, it's starting to slip, in my personal view. Just is what it is. You can't keep having these performances where it's taking you, overall, 9, 10 rounds. Sometimes you can't even knock opponents out like this. And then on top of that, sometimes these fights are a little bit more competitive than what we once originally thought they were going to be.
Padley, he was able to hit him at will, because there were moments where Shakur, he would show flashes of himself where he would throw a nice little combination, but then all of a sudden he would pull back.
Right, but DontaesBoxingNation is saying that Shakur Stevenson would show little flashes of himself. Once again, is this something that we've not seen Shakur Stevenson do, at this particular weight class? Now, of course, certain people may say, well, Shakur Stevenson didn't look like this against Oscar Valdez. He didn't look like this against Jamel Herring, right? But that was at 130. So at the end of the day, you can't compare that performance. Vasily Lomachenko looked way more dominant at 130 and at 126 than he did at 135. Lomachenko's only losses of his career, at least other than the Orlando Salido fight, once he started to reach the peak of his career, was against Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney, guys that were probably a decent amount bigger than him, at least in terms of weight. But the thing is that, when it comes down to it, Lomachenko still did not look the same because of the weight class. No one ever says, or Dante never says that, oh, well, Lomachenko didn't do the things that he usually did. It was a strange performance from Lomachenko. Once again, the thing is about Shakur Stevenson is that it's not really strange from him, because we have to take a look at what the fighter is able to do at this particular weight class. Not everyone is a Canelo Alvarez or a Usyk or, a Terrence Bud Crawford that when they move up the weight, they still look phenomenal, or an Inoue. And that's why, in my view, that Shakur Stevenson, not only because of the dominance, but the lack of resume, and on top of that, the skills are all there, in my view, but the lack of dominance, in my view, and the lack of resume, there's no way, in my personal view, that if you know how to logically rank a list, there's no way that he's top 5 pound for pound. I'm sorry, it just is what it is. He's never really defeated an official A-grade level fighter in his career. Maybe Oscar Valdez, if you want to stretch it and give him that, but even that is a bit debatable. He has no A-grade level wins on his resume. And listen, what I'll say is this. I've kind of went after Gervonta Tank Davis's resume in the past, but even Gervonta Tank Davis has 2 A-grade threats debatably in his career against Ryan Garcia and also against that, overall of a Frank Martin. I mean, that win that Gervonta Tank Davis has over Jose Pedraza, that probably is just as big of a win in his career, as what Shakur Stevenson has. I mean, maybe, probably the Oscar Valdez win is bigger. I would say that Valdez was looked at as a greater opponent, especially at the time. But, I mean, other than that, his resume is really not that deep.
He would get Padley on the ropes, and Shakur wouldn't let his hands go. He would be extremely hesitant. The crazy thing is, every time Shakur would hit Josh Padley with a body shot, Padley, he would either double over, he would wince, he would make it very obvious that he was weak to the body. But earlier on,
well, I'm not really going to state that every time that Shakur landed a body shot that he would wince or that he would double over, because if that happened, then he would have got knocked out within the first half of the fight. But what I will state is that the body work clearly was starting to affect him a little bit later on. But Shakur Stevenson was, he was landing way too many flush blows, especially to the body, in order for Joshua Padley to really last that long. Just is what it is.
Like Shakur didn't notice it, and he was letting him off the hook a lot of times when he would hurt him. Because there's no doubt in my mind that Shakur Stevenson, he could have knocked out Josh Padley within the first 3 rounds. Now, Shakur...
Well, then I need to recommend you the most nearest optometrist, or, an eye doctor, in order to get your eyesight checked, because I don't know what fucking fight you were watching. Because at the end of the day, Shakur Stevenson, I've seen the same guy that I've always seen at 135 pounds and also a little bit at 130. Great fighter. Great technically, great technical fighter. Almost perfect in almost every single category. Fast as lightning. But the power, overall is just not there.
Where he did start going to the body a little bit more later on in the fight. And once again, Padley, he fell apart once he started getting hit with all those consecutive body shots. Shakur Stevenson, he was hot and cold throughout this entire fight. And I felt a lot of...
Which is pretty much like Shakur throughout his past several performances. It just is what it is. You know, we've seen it overall once again against a couple of other fighters. You know, I believe we've seen it in his last fight before this. You know, and I think even another fight not too long ago. So like I said, it just is what it is. In his last few performances, Shakur has not been overtly impressive, at least in my personal view.
It was psychological, you know, because Shakur is such an internet type of person. You know, he usually caters to what a lot of people say on the internet about him. I feel like he was really thinking in his head, what if this guy catches me with something stupid? I feel like Shakur was also thinking about what Gervonta Tank Davis has said when Gervonta said, man, I don't want to get embarrassed. My worst fear is getting embarrassed and being a meme on the internet for years and years. I really feel like that was in the back of Shakur's mind when he was fighting this guy, Josh Padley. The fact that he didn't really know too much about Josh Padley outside of just seeing him fight on the internet, and the fact that it was a different style compared to who he was originally supposed to fight, Floyd Schofield. I feel like this is the reason why Shakur was so hot and cold, and he's over here thinking about the hate that he receives, and if he were once again to get caught with something stupid and possibly either get knocked.
And Shakur Stevenson, you can tell that criticism is getting to him. It just is what it is, because the way that Shakur Stevenson was talking about it, you can tell that, you know, he believes that the criticism is there. It just is what it is. You know, Shakur Stevenson, you know, he is somewhat feeding into that criticism because he knows it's true. It just is what it is. And I understand that Shakur is an exemplary fighter. He's an exceptional fighter, but I just don't ever see him becoming the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. I just don't. Now, of course, you know, in Shakur Stevenson's mind, of course, he has to always believe that he can become the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And of course, you should always believe, you know, that you're the best fighter, you know, with whoever you end up getting into the ring with, or that at least you can be. But the thing is that, you know, with Shakur Stevenson, it's like, just from, you know, taking a look at it from the outside in, from an analytic point of view, I don't ever see him beating Gervonta Tank Davis. I just don't.
Down or even stagger against an opponent like this, we would never stop seeing the replays of it on the internet. I believe this is what made him so hot and cold in the fight. And it was funny because I was watching this fight listening to the UK commentators. And even though they are definitely not as biased as Todd Grisham, they made it very clear that Shakur Stevenson was the only fighter on this entire card that was expected to do more, even when he was dominating the fight. Because they didn't say that when it came to Shiraz fighting against Adames. We know Shiraz...
Right, but Dante, why would you make an idiotic comparison like that? There's no offense against Dante's Boxing Nation, but this is why I always say that this dude, that he just doesn't have like any fucking clue about boxing whatsoever. Now, Dante's Boxing Nation, of course, is kind of trying to allege there that that was kind of racially motivated. And I mean, sure, black fighters, they end up getting certain criticisms or getting called boring, you know, overall for being technically sound, you know, overall, you know, and it's a little bit racially motivated a lot of the times. Of course, we all know this. And a part of that criticism is racially motivated, sure. But a part of that criticism is also because, dude, you're looked at as one of the top 10, debatably top 5 pound-for-pound fighters on some people's list. He's not top 5 on my list for sure. But I mean, you know, top 5 on certain people's list, you know, in some of the world of boxing. You have certain people stating that he's the best fighter at that weight class. You're fighting a guy that has 4 knockouts on his resume, 15 total fights, I believe, before this fight. He had 2 days notice of this fight, and it takes you fucking 9 rounds to knock this guy out. I mean, I'm sorry. It just is what it is. Now, Dante's trying to, you know, of course, play, you know, the racial game. And then, of course, he's trying to say, well, they weren't saying this about Hamza Shiraz. Dude, Hamza Shiraz has never won a world title before. Like, Hamza Shiraz was in his first title fight ever. Shakur Stevenson is a legitimate 3-weight division champion. Like, at the end of the day, he's been in the fight with Jamel Herring and Oscar Valdez. No, I don't think that those guys are full-on legitimate A-grade level fighters. But at the end of the day, Shakur Stevenson has been there and done that. He has the experience. It just is what it is. So you can't compare overall the expectations of a fighter that's looked at, first of all, on the top 10 pound-per-pound list. But then on top of that, he's been in several different title fights and, you know, different weight classes compared to a guy to where it's his first weight class and it's his first title fight ever. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? So, you know, and many people overall, you know, once again, you know, for those of you that know the saying, to much, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. And at the end of the day, if you're going to be given this, you know, overall, you know, this crown of being one of the top 10, debatably top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world, You have to be more dominant than that, especially against a fighter that is looked at as a B or C grade level fighter, came in on 2 days notice, and a guy that pretty much is known for not having a great amount of power, especially with his style. It just is what it is. He had 4 knockouts on his resume, and he really hadn't fought anybody of great note. So, I mean, it just is what it is. Even Canelo Alvarez, who has an all-time great resume, is an all-time great level fighter. Even he has been somewhat receiving criticism for not being as dominant against guys that are way bigger than him and actually have power, in Jaime Munguia and that of Edgar Berlanga, or at least guys that are bigger than him. So, of course, Shakur Stevenson, he's going to have to roll with some of the criticism. It is what it is.
Didn't really do too much. He moved around the ring, he threw his jab, and they were praising him for it. But of course, when it comes to fighters on a coincidence.
Well, were they really praising Hamza Shiraz? Because I think that the commentators, that they all said that they thought that Hamza Shiraz, that he had lost the fight. Now, don't get it twisted. I thought that the commentary crew, I thought that they were biased in the multitude of fights, and it was very clear that they did want Hamza Shiraz to win. But I thought that they were relatively fair in giving Carlos Adams his credit. And they all stated that they thought Adams had clearly won the fight. So once again, it just is what it is. Dante can try to play this victimhood bullshit all he wants to, all this racialhood, victimhood bullshit. Listen, it's very understandable that a certain amount of black fighters, that they do deal with double standards and get called quote-unquote boring and not interesting in a runner, because, of course, they are black fighters and people overall don't want them to be as good or as dominant as what they are. That is very true a lot of the times, and that's a part of it. But a part of it also, once again, is that Shakur Stevenson, listen, at the end of the day, you're top 10 pound for pound. At least you're supposed to be, and you're in the ring with these guys that are really looked at as C-grade level fighters, and you can't stop these guys. Like, it is what it is. And then on top of that, sometimes these fights are really a little bit more competitive than what they should be.
The dentalists, they are always held to a higher standard. So the commentators, they started off by acknowledging that
Right, and I understand that, Dante's Boxing Nation, but the only way that you really could have compared this is if this would have been an undefeated black fighter that would have been in their first title shot ever. And then the commentators would have had that, same standard. That would have been the only way that you really could have compared it. Like, had this been, Keyshawn Davis and he was in his fight against Dennis Baranchik or something like that, although I don't think Dennis Baranchik is as skilled as Carlos Adams, taking a look at Carlos Adams in that fight, but that is something that would be a little bit more understandable if the commentators were just grilling Keyshawn Davis the whole time, in his first title fight. But this is not Shakur Stevenson's first title fight.
Shakur Stevenson was obviously dominating the fight, and then they would say, yeah, but we want to see more. We want to see more, right? And then Shakur would give them more.
Right, Dante's Boxing Nation, but the thing is this. You want to have these expectations on certain fighters that you like to tear down, like Canelo Alvarez. Like, Canelo gets criticism from you for not knocking out Berlanga or not knocking out Jaime Munguia. And those are actual guys with power and that have actually either A, been champions or have been undefeated. And they actually had size and power over Canelo Alvarez. They probably weren't the more powerful puncher over Canelo, but, overall, they definitely had size over Canelo Alvarez and they definitely had power to boot. So I mean, the thing is that you criticize Canelo Alvarez for that, and then you criticize overall other fighters for not having that great of a performance, because they're supposed to be held in high expectations. But then when it comes to the fighters that you like, you don't want to move the bar. You only want to move the bar when they're successful, but then when they lose or when they don't have that good of a performance, you don't want to mention anything about it. That's not how boxing works.
And then they will say, no, but we want to.
And in general, that's not how life works. At the end of the day, if you're looked at in a greater light, it just is what it is. You have to be held under greater scrutiny.
See more than that. We want to see more razzle and dazzle. They kept saying, Shakur, he keeps talking about how he's one of the best fighters, so he's supposed to do this and he's supposed to do that, right? So
Shakur Stevenson hasn't just stated that he's one of the best fighters. He stated that he's the #1 pound for pound fighter. There's a difference.
Once again, every time when Shakur Stevenson would raise the bar in this fight, the commentators, they would raise the bar. So then they would say, oh yeah, but even though he's doing more and he's giving us the razzle and dazzle, if he doesn't get the knockout, this will not be considered an impressive performance. So Shakur Stevenson.
And it wouldn't have been. You tell me that this dude, that's a British fighter. Remember, all the guys that Canelo Alvarez fought at 168, apparently they were these weak European white boys. They were these bums. Overall, Canelo Alvarez, he was getting outboxed by these guys. All that is bullshit, by the way. But, Callum Smith, by the way, who just defeated a very talented, undefeated fighter in Joshua Buatsi. You notice that Dante's Boxing Nation hasn't mentioned that whatsoever. Remember, Callum Smith was supposed to be this, complete bum I kept telling people overall that Callum Smith, that a lot of people were sleeping on him and that he was more skilled than what a lot of people were really trying to let on. Remember, those are weak European bums. But Shakur Stevenson, who can knock this dude out within the first half of the fight, a guy that has 4 fucking knockouts, and then on top of that, a guy that came in on 2 days' notice, hasn't fought anybody in his career. Overall, Shakur Stevenson is not supposed to be held to a high standard. So then what does that really mean, that what you truly think about Shakur Stevenson, Dante?
Stevenson, obviously, he gets the knockout win. And once he got the knockout win, the commentators, they didn't sound too happy about it. It came off as if deep down they were actually hoping he wouldn't get the knockout so they could criticize him for not getting the knockout. If you are the type of person that likes to listen to the commentary while you're watching this fight, just pay attention to what they say and how they say it when they're talking about fighters on a coincidental list versus fighters on the hope list.
I do agree with DontaesBoxingNation there, that they definitely talk about other fighters a little bit differently, that maybe quote unquote on the coincidental list, or certain fighters that they want to promote, especially a little bit racially, a little bit more. They talk about them different. But listen, at the end of the day, Shakur is a guy, once again, to where a lot is expected of him. You're talking all this shit about how you can beat everyone in the division. Then on top of that, you're the #1 pound for pound fighter, and you're going 9 rounds with fighters like Joshua Padley. Like, are you fucking serious? Just is what it is.
You will never hear them say a fighter on the hope list, even though he's winning the fight and dominating, it won't be considered an impressive performance unless he gets the knockout. We know what time it is. So hopefully we get Javante.
Well, I'm not going to completely agree with that, because Teofimo Lopez, in my view, he did end up having some criticisms, overall by some commentators. Now, maybe not by these same ones, but, overall by different commentators, and there were some other fighters that also received a little bit of criticism as well. But listen, at the end of the day, Shakur Stevenson, I would say that he's got to improve his performances, but I just don't think that there's really anything else that he can do.
Javante versus Shakur next. After this performance, I would not be surprised if they have Gervonta Tank Davis as a massive favorite to beat Shakur. But we still have to...
I wouldn't have Gervonta Tank Davis as a massive favorite, but I would have him probably about a 3-1 favorite over Shakur Stevenson, just in my personal view.
See how Gervonta is going to look next weekend. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. Let's see what Mr. AKHi TV had to say as well.
So the one and only Gervonta Davis gave his reaction to Shakur stopping Josh in the 9th round by stating, quote, "Laugh out loud." Immediately after that, Shakur responded to Gervonta by telling him, "Stay focused. Lamont ready to tap that chin." There you have it. Gervonta was not impressed by Shakur at all. I guess Gervonta was expecting Shakur to get Josh out of there earlier than the 9th round, kind of like Joseph Parker did to his late replacement opponent, even though he had the better opponent.
Yes, he definitely did. Now, that being stated, was Martin McCauley, in my view, at his best? No, he wasn't. Now, a certain amount of people, of course, have brought up the sleep and all that other stuff. Of course, the lack of sleep that he probably got, coming in overall into the fight on 2 days' notice. And, I mean, I'm sure that that was a part of it. But listen, at the end of the day, the man clearly had gained a certain amount of weight in the midsection. The man, of course, clearly does not take care of himself and eats himself out, overall, at certain fights, in the offseason. It just is what it is. Now from what I'm hearing, apparently his trainer, don't remember overall his name, but apparently overall he pushed him to take this fight, which in my view was kind of a snake-ass move. Which of course you can watch a great video from that at Hatman Strikes Back, him recently talking about it. I recommend it, where he was talking about his trainer, and I agree. Because apparently Martin McCauley was going to be in a title eliminator matchup next against F.A. Agjagba in a very winnable fight. Now, of course, the Joseph Parker fight is a great fight. And of course, if you end up winning that fight, that's the biggest win of your career. But why the hell would you end up taking that fight or pushing for your fighter to take that fight, at least allegedly? Now, apparently that was according to Martin McCauley's case. Like, I guess we don't really know. But this is not the first time that I've heard something, a little bit slippery or snake-like from that trainer. So, I tend to believe it a little bit more, although I have to do a little bit more of an investigation. But I mean, the thing is that why the hell would you want to push your fighter unless you were pretty much just out for the money, overall to really take that fight, unless you were just that dumb, overall to really want the biggest opportunity of your career. But he obviously wasn't ready. The man was like 40 pounds over fucking weight. And on top of that, the man had 2 days notice. Like, come on. Like, it's one thing if Martin McCauley is in good condition, and if he's a guy that, overall is kind of ready to answer the bell, like certain other fighters, replacement. Like, Joshua Padley was in way better condition than what Martin McCauley was. And McCauley is a guy that's always been a little bit fluffy anyway, but come on. Like, that was just embarrassing. Like, you come in the fight apparently at 310 pounds at 6'5". Like, are you fucking serious?
Shakur, on the other hand, he went 9 rounds with Josh. And that's why Gervonta was laughing at his performance. Now, even though Shakur looked as sharp as ever, the way he performed against Josh, it seemed like he had so much respect for Josh in the ring. He was acting as if he was fighting Devin Haney or Gervonta in terms of not letting his hands go as often as he should have had. Remember, Josh had only 4 KOs on his record, and he took the fight on 2 days' notice, meaning he wasn't in shape to go 12 rounds. Yes,
I agree with that. And he obviously still was in very good shape, but, at the end of the day, he should have not been in shape the last 9 rounds. And some of the shots that Shakur Stevenson was landing on that of Joshua Padley, I'm sorry, but he should have been out of there. It is what it is. Now, do I, agree a little bit with the factor that Shakur Stevenson, that sometimes he fought a little bit too tentatively? Yeah. But, what that tells me is that Shakur Stevenson, either A, that his skill set is a little bit overrated, or B, when it comes down to it, that his level of power, that it's really so minuscule, overall, that's not really going to be a factor in some of his bigger fights at 135 and up, or possibly a little bit of both.
Shakur body shots were the key to getting Josh out of there. However, Josh wasn't supposed to be there by the 9th round.
Agreed.
He wasn't in shape to be in there by the 9th round. He was supposed to be gone before that. And that's why, again, Gervonta is laughing at Shakur's performance. I remember when Shakur was at 126 and even 130, when he was fighting this type of level of opposition, man, Shakur was letting punches fly. He was throwing 4 to 6 punches combo every time while being defensive.
It's easier to throw combos like that when you out-height and out-reach a certain amount of these opponents. And on top of that, you're very, you're a lot quicker and you're bigger naturally for those weight classes. Like I said, Shakur is finally in the weight class to where he kind of naturally fits in. Shakur doesn't really belong at 126. He belongs more at 130 or 135, really more at 135. Because even at 130, I thought that he was kind of bigger than a lot of those guys. Like, I think that he's bigger than someone like Lamont Roach, for example. But the thing is that, once again, at 135, the more you move up the weight classes, especially if you can't transfer the power or your body very well, there are going to be certain things that you're not going to be able to do in other weight classes. You might have to throw less. You might have to be, at times, a little bit more apprehensive or at least careful to throw because you can't let as many punches fly. Overall, once again, you have to, pace yourself a little bit better. And it's very obvious that even Shakur Stevenson realizes himself that he can't do the same things at these particular weight classes because his power cannot affect these guys.
Responsible.
And even overall at the lower weight classes, like, it's not like he was this grand puncher. Like, yeah, he knocked down Oscar Valdez and probably could have stopped him had he put on the pace a little bit more. And of course, he eventually stopped Jamel Herring. But give me a fucking break. Like, Jamel Herring, like, it is what it is. Jamel Herring's a decent fighter. He's nowhere near, an A-grade level fighter.
But at 135, for some reason, Shakur is not comfortable to let combos fly like that anymore. He's comfortable.
At some particular reason, it's pretty obvious why that is. Once again, Shakur Stevenson is in a higher weight class. He's also a guy, once again, that, fights in that particular style. And he's realizing that his power is not affecting these guys. And that's why I also say with Crawford moving up to fight Canelo Alvarez, for those of you that remember when Canelo fought Dimitri Bivol, a part of the reason why Canelo Alvarez lost that fight is because when Dimitri Bivol felt Canelo's punches, he felt the power obviously a little bit, but he did not feel the power anywhere near enough as what some of the former opponents that Canelo Alvarez fought. Because when Canelo fought in a division that he really should have not been in, of course his body was more adjusted to that weight class as what it would have been maybe in the past or now because, of course he fought at 168 for a little bit then. But Canelo was not really a guy that belongs at 168, not at 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach. He doesn't belong there. So the thing is that Dimitri Bivol felt Canelo Alvarez's power, and he said, I felt power like this before, and probably power that has been a little bit more strong, and then on top of that, Canelo started to gas out a little bit because he was a little bit too heavy for that fight in my personal view, and he was fighting a guy that could actually punch back with him in exchange in certain exchanges because overall it was a guy that, first of all, not only was bigger than him, but on top of that, or at least naturally adjusted to the weight class, But on top of that, was a guy that was used to that level of power. And Canelo was just not going to win that fight, not with the lack of stamina that he had in that fight and the weight that he had gained.
He was just countering, and he doesn't lead much. The reason behind that is because he doesn't feel defensively responsible leading. You see, what made Floyd Mayweather so unique is the ability to lead and still be defensively responsible. He could counter, but that's just extra. He counters, he leads.
Well, oftentimes when certain people, when they end up doing this, it's either usually because of one or two things from what I've seen. Like Israel Madrimov, for example, he's just a fighter that's limited. Like if he can't take charge, he has a problem. But the other reason usually is because fighters, they end up moving the weight class and they end up having to set up their opponents with a certain counter. It's either A, because maybe their, skills could be a little bit more limited than what it's going on, or they realize that they don't have the power to mix it up on the inside as much. And if they get caught with something on the inside, they could be in a little bit of a problem. And if it becomes more of an inside fight or a brawl, they may start having an issue. Perhaps it's a little bit of both A and B.
Does everything right. That's what made Floyd Mayweather a completed fighter.
Well, Floyd not only, in my view, Floyd not only was an astronomically skilled fighter, but Floyd at least had great power at 135 or 140. Now, by the time that he was at 147, his power started to dip off a little bit because he had a little bit of hand issues. And on top of that, Floyd Mayweather, he was not really naturally adjusted to that weight class. But at least to a degree, Floyd's power and his skill set would kind of carry over to both 154 and that of 147. Shakur Stevenson's power is not even carrying over to 135. So, once again, I just don't see him becoming the number one pound-for-pound fighter, but we'll see.
Of boxing. And you best believe Gervonta brings that type of skill to the table. And not just that, he also has destructive power.
He absolutely does. When you talk about fighters in the sport of boxing that have the most devastating power in either hand, you're talking about probably three fighters. You're talking about Gervonta Tank Davis, Naoya Inoue, and Artur Beterbiev. And maybe there's another fighter out there that, I'm not really thinking of. Of course, there is Deontay Wilder and maybe some other fighters that I'm not personally thinking of. But Deontay Wilder isn't really a championship level fighter anymore at this point in time in his career. At least in my personal view, obviously. He's taken 2 losses and 2 pretty bad ass whoopings recently in his most recent fight. So it is what it is. But I mean, other than that, fighters that are on the pound for pound list right now that I can think of that have that destructive of power, there's really only 2 or 3 names. Beterbiev, Gervonta Tank Davis, and Naoya Inoue.
Said on my review video, Gervonta got to be licking his chops watching this performance by Shakur. Next thing you know, he tweets laugh out loud. Listen, this fight between Gervonta and Shakur has been long overdue. The time is now. But now Gervonta has a real test in front of him. You guys heard what Shakur told Gervonta. Lamont ready to tap that chin.
Well, does Gervonta really have a real test in front of him? Or is this pretty much another one of those fights that is pretty much, Gervonta is trying to hype up the fight into something that it actually isn't? Lamont Roach has a little bit of skill. He's not a bad fighter whatsoever. He's a solid B grade level fighter. But in terms of power, he doesn't really have anything to threaten Gervonta Tank Davis with, not unless he hits him consistently throughout the whole entire fight. And on top of that, he appears to be a little bit smaller than Gervonta Tank Davis, and he's a champion at 130. He's never been a champion at 135 before. And the biggest win of his career is a win over that of a Hector Garcia. So, I mean, I like Gervonta Tank Davis as a fighter. I think that he is a phenomenal talent, both skills-wise and, of course, athletically. But the thing is that people are getting sick and tired of you fighting these bums. It is what it is.
You guys saw how Shakur respected Josh in there in the early rounds. So, Lamont Roach is a real fight.
No, it's not. Lamont Roach, what Lamont Roach is Lamont Roach is a very decent fighter who ended up beating a guy in Hector Garcia that, first of all, was never really an A-grade skilled level fighter in the first place, in my personal view. And then on top of that, a guy that probably was never the same after he got stopped by Gervonta Tank Davis. So I mean, give me a fucking break. Lamont Roach is a decent fight. It's a B-grade level fight. But for the standards of Gervonta Tank Davis, see, both Gervonta Tank Davis and Shakur Stevenson, they're not really living up to standards, overall, really in, both categories. But the thing is about Shakur Stevenson is that his is even worse because at least Gervonta Tank Davis can eventually fight better level competition. As long as he beats them, he's not going to get criticized as harshly. But the thing is about Shakur Stevenson is that, unfortunately for him, the problem that he has, I don't know if he can fix it.
Reason why, he has sneaky power, like Gervonta said, and he has skill. So Gervonta can't sleep on him. But after Lamont Roach, if Gervonta is victorious, then he has to turn his attention towards Shakur. That's the fight to make. And it's a winnable fight at that. For Tank. Not saying Shakur is an easy fight, because even though I wasn't impressed with Shakur at the end of the day, Shakur is a tough fight for anyone.
I agree with that. He's a very exceptionally technical fighter, and he's a very talented fighter. But I just don't think that he's going to defeat Gervonta Tank Davis. I just don't see it. I mean, maybe if he outspeeds him and ties him up and, is technical and literally sharp throughout the whole entire fight. But I don't know if I see Gervonta Tank Davis really being threatened by Shakur Stevenson's power. And Shakur Stevenson has already shown a little bit of deterrence in terms of throwing certain punches. So unless he puts rocks in his gloves or something like that, I don't see how Shakur Stevenson beats Gervonta Tank Davis. I just don't.
He will still be anyone.
Because even Dimitri Bivol in the recent fight against Better Beef, when he had Better Beef tire out, not only did he do that with his movement and his footwork and creating the vacated space, but Bivol at least has power to keep you in certain ranges that he needs to keep you in order to win the fight and to keep you honest. Shakur Stevenson doesn't really have that.
Toughest test today because of his style. He's hard to corner, he's hard to figure out, and he's even hard.
To be honest with you, I'm not really even sure Shakur Stevenson would defeat someone like a Ryan Garcia. Now, he's a decent amount more skilled than a Ryan Garcia, but combined with the size of a Ryan Garcia and the level of power that he has, I'm not really 100% if I would favor Shakur Stevenson over Ryan Garcia. I mean, I would probably favor him over Ryan, just because Ryan has a certain amount of faults in his style. He fights very tall. He's a guy that has his chin wide open in the air. He does not have a great defense. He's a guy that, turns his back to a fucking 180-degree angle, whatever the fuck that is, whenever opponents come in near at him. But if he caught Shakur Stevenson early, like what he caught Devin Haney, and on top of that, Shakur is smaller than Ryan Garcia, and if Ryan Garcia pretty much walked through his punches throughout a certain amount of the fight, which he probably could do, that'd be an interesting fight. I'm not 100% sure if Shakur would win that fight.
Harder to hit, but I believe.
Now, that being stated, interestingly enough, I do think that Shakur actually has a better chance to defeat someone like a Teofimo Lopez and also that of a Devin Haney. Now, I think that both of those fighters in certain areas are technically better overall than that of a Ryan Garcia. But sometimes just because you're technically better doesn't always mean that you're the better or the greater all-around fighter. Just like I said in my most recent video, you got to take a look at the technique of the fighter, the athleticism of the fighter, the psychology of the fighter, and the extra factors, the X factors. And when you take a look at Ryan Garcia, one thing is this, he's a guy that is very limited as a fighter, yes, but when you talk about that level of power and his size, it's nothing to fuck around with. There's a reason why he beat Devin Haney. Yes, of course, he was caught on a little bit of something extra special, but I think that Devin Haney is on some extra special as well.
Gervonta against Shakur, he's going to apply a lot of pressure. And Shakur is going to have to earn his respect against Gervonta. He's not going to be able to just move around the ring.
Agreed. And he might even be a little bit more tentative to throw against someone like a Gervonta Tank Davis with that level of power. So we'll see.
Is not going to let him. He has to earn Gervonta respect. But can he? Is the million-dollar question. Only time will tell. Hopefully they make the fight come to fruition next. PBC is on board. Gervonta is on board. They both said they only want the top-tier fighters at the moment in time. And guess who else on board? Eddie Hearn, Turkey, and Shakur Stevenson. Everyone is on board to making this fight next. So hopefully the fight comes to fruition.
Well, allegedly everyone's on board. Gervonta Tank Davis allegedly says that he's on board. And this is the thing about AKHi DontaesBoxingNation. They love to bitch, moan, and complain about double standards. But whenever it comes to a Canelo Alvarez or certain guys apparently agreeing to terms, they say that, oh, we don't believe it, that Canelo's going to duck him and all sort of stuff, blah, 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 because that's what he does. But notice when it comes to Gervonta Tank Davis, even though he stated that he doesn't want to fight Keyshawn Davis or Shakur Stevenson or any of these guys, and years ago he pretty much avoided the Lomachenko fight, or was not interested in the Lomachenko fight at least. Notice how AKHi TV or Dante, they've never said that Gervonta is the biggest cherry picker of all time. Notice how they've never said that he's the most overrated fighter of all time. So these guys love to bitch and moan about double standards, but they pretty much implement it within every single video anyways. So that's why I say you can't take anything what these guys say seriously.
That being said, go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Who would you favor out of Gervonta and Shakur? After
I would favor Gervonta Tank Davis, undoubtedly. I would have him at least as a 3-1 favorite in the fight. I'm sorry, but Shakur Stevenson has looked too tentative in his most recent fights. I do assume that more than likely that he would try to be better and, try to grit it up a little bit more against Gervonta Tank Davis. But Gervonta is also an exceptional level fighter in certain areas. He's very defensively sound at certain times. He does get hit sometimes a little bit too often, and sometimes he needs to be a little bit more offensive in some of his fights. But Gervonta Tank Davis has that type of power to where he can knock you out at any given moment in time with either shot. And on top of that, Gervonta's not a bad boxer. So I just don't know if I see Shakur Stevenson. I'm not quite sure if I see him beating Gervonta Tank Davis because he's going to have to gain his respect in certain ways. And to be quite honest with you, Billy Joe Saunders, I think, had more power against Canelo Alvarez than what Shakur would probably have against that of a Gervonta Tank Davis. I'm not sure Gervonta Tank Davis is going to respect Shakur Stevenson's power whatsoever. Now, I could be wrong, but we'll see.
Seeing Shakur performance tonight against Josh Padley. Subscribe below and to be continued on the next episode of AKHi TV. Peace out.
But that pretty much is about it for this video. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But we'll see what ends up happening next. That pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see what ends up happening. I wish the best for Shakur Stevenson, and I, overall do give him a shot to defeat Gervonta Tank Davis. He's an exceptionally skilled level fighter. He's definitely quicker than Gervonta Tank Davis and possibly a little bit more elusive. But Gervonta Tank Davis is elusive and skilled also to a degree. Their skill sets are not that wide apart in my view. But the one thing that is super wide apart is the power. And it's not even like Gervonta Tank Davis just has A-grade level power like a Teofimo Lopez. He might be debatably, pound for pound, the hardest puncher in all of boxing, other than maybe Naoya Inoue or Artur. So, once again, we'll see what ends up happening. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.